Father because of everything that Jesus Christ has done. And I think it's not because that we're so much wiser or so much better taught necessarily. I think we far too often, I know I do, we tend to overlook the power of the presence of the Spirit in our lives. And it's through that presence and through that power that we probably have a better understanding of the consequences of rejecting Jesus Christ as our Lord. That those without a relationship with the Lord, they don't even have a clue. You know, if anything should motivate us to have a desire, you know, it's interesting that Alan mentioned, you know, that desire that we have that motivates everything. That desire within us, we should have this desire to want other people to have what we have. You know, we would like to have other people, know who Jesus Christ is and what he has done for us and how he gives us the ability to live. There is nothing that's easy. Nothing. Life is hard. It's not made for sissies. Christianity is hard. It's not made for sissies. I know that sometimes, you know, we read stories. We read about Peter. I've always found Peter to be interesting because, you know, I can relate to Peter, you know, the emotion that he has, the passion that he has, and then at the same time, it all just falls apart so quickly, and then he has to suck everything up and say how sorry he is and start all over again. And then there's somebody like Paul. We'd love to have the boldness of Paul, to be able to stand up to people in the marketplace, just to be able to say, you know, to meet every argument with just astute intellectual righteousness. But far too often, we're really more on the level of Judas. You know, I mean, I've found sometimes, do I have more in common with Judas or with Jesus? You know, last week, we saw that Pilate, he was walking away from Jesus after asking the question, what is truth? Yet, he didn't wait for Jesus to provide an answer. He just asked the question and walked away. What we are witnessing was not a man looking for answers, but rather a man that was hopelessly missing the opportunity to find it. We are witnessing a man who is making choices that are consistent with someone who has no idea who Jesus Christ is. And in many ways, that should fill us with a profound sense of sadness. Now, Pilate has had the freedom to hear what truth is, yet he walked away. Pilate had the opportunity to release an innocent man, but instead, he made the choice to subject Jesus to an unimaginable cruelty and torture that we can barely comprehend. Pilate could have, at least from a purely human perspective, made any number of different choices. Yet we must always remember that the actions of Pilate followed the plan of God exactly. And those plans had been in place since before eternity, before the foundations of the world. And this is the interesting thing. And this is what kind of, we can't hardly grasp this. Every action Pilate took, he did so freely. It was his choice to do it, yet it followed the plan of God. And I know that's where our ears, you know, we want to have our brains leak out of our ears when we deal with this whole sovereignty of God thing. There's no real good way to explain this. About the best example I ever heard was this. You know, you've got, you know, when you had children, you have a playroom. You don't put toys in the room that you know the kid dislikes. You put toys in the room that he does like. But even though you've got all these toys in the room that he does like, you know what toy he's going to play with. You're the parent. You've watched this kid. This kid's either going to be the blocks and cars type of kid with a dump truck, or he's going to be the hammer and nail type of kid with anything that he can use as a hammer. But you know which one he's going to play with, and then he plays with it. Did you remove that kid's freedom by knowing that he was going to play with that toy? Nope. You just put it in there. But you know the kid. And you know what he's doing. Why? He's yours. See, God knows what we're going to do, and God makes sure that his plan is going to work out exactly the way he does it and the way he wants it, but he's going to do it through people's free, willing choices. Is it that simple? No, not even close. It's just the way I wanted to explain it this morning so I can make my point. But the bottom line is this. We have freedom. We have the freedom that God has given us. But you know what? The only people in this world who actually have true freedom are those that know Jesus Christ, their Lord and Savior. Because, see, we have been released from the tyranny of evil. We have been taken out. Peter says, he says, we have been brought out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. Guess what? When you're in darkness, you can't see. I've been a diabetic now since 1983. And over the course of that time, I've had laser treatments on my eyes because one of the side effects of being diabetic is that on your retina, your body produces new veins all the time on your retina, but in a diabetic, they're weak and they tend to bleed. And so science has come up with this wonderful way to stop that from happening. They take a laser beam, they shoot it through your pupil, and they basically burn all of the peripheral of your retina so that no new weak blood vessels can grow there, and to stop those that have been bleeding to bleed again. It's very barbaric, but it's highly effective. And it's really painful. But it works. And I think that we sometimes realize that there's reasons why we can't see well in darkness. I can't see anything in darkness. If you go into my office, you're wondering, why is there so much light in here? Well, because I really need a lot of light to see. If I go into a dim room, I can't see anything at all. I mean, it's to the point now where I either have to ask Francis to read things for me, or I accost strangers in Walmart to tell me what the back of the label says. Sometimes I've gotten smarter now. I can take out my phone, take a picture, and make it bigger so that I can read it. And then the management thinks that I'm trying to shop their store. I'm really not. We don't see well in the dark. Some see better than others. It's still darkness. Those of us that have been brought into light, we have true freedom. And see, those of us in the light, we're the only ones that can see that it's either Jesus or face the consequences. People that don't know Jesus or people that are in the darkness don't even know that there are consequences out there. In our passage today in John chapter 18, verses the end of 38 to 19, verse 7, the Apostle John gives us a deeper insight into what transpired after Pilate walked away from the very person of truth after he asked Jesus what truth actually was. Follow along as I read this fairly brief passage here. After he said this is referring to what is truth. After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." One of the first things we see here in verses 38b of chapter 18 through the verse 3 of chapter 19 is that when we reject Jesus, we're setting ourselves up to accept everything, anything. There's a certain amount of irony that John is communicating here as he records these events. But remember always that John is recording these events under the inspiration of God. Many commentaries want to discuss as to, well, why did John write this down when Mark wrote this down and Matthew wrote this down and Luke wrote this down? Why didn't John? John wrote exactly what God wanted him to write. There is a doctrine of revelation. There is something that runs through this whole, a truth that runs through all of the Bible that proves to us that God has in the Bible what he intends to have in the Bible. Are there many questions that we have about things that are not covered in the Bible? Yeah, we all have them. But guess what? If God wanted us to know, we'd know. This Bible is the revelation of Jesus Christ. The whole Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, it reveals Jesus Christ. The Old Testament reveals over and over again the need for Jesus Christ. The New Testament reveals the person of Jesus Christ and the price he paid and the victory he has won. The irony the Lord allows John to write here shows there's like this total disconnect between the question Pilate asked of Jesus in verses 33 to 38 and then the way Pilate addresses the Jewish crowd beginning in verse 38b. He comes out, he talks about to Jesus up here, what we read last week. He talks to him, he asks him these questions, and then he comes out to the Jews and he goes, "I find no guilt in him." Now, you would think that when someone says, this guy's innocent, there's no guilt in him, that he would follow up that statement with the next logical and reasonable action. He would then release Jesus. Instead, Pilate embarks on an attempt to appease the crowd in order to achieve some immediate end. We know from history that during times of national holidays, especially during the times of Passover, which was, that's a big, huge celebration. For the Jews. Probably the only thing bigger than that would be, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. But there's a big celebration that when you get that many people in one spot, there's always a higher likelihood that there's going to be unrest. And so Pilate wants everything to be quiet. He doesn't want problems. And John doesn't really give us any insight into Pilate's thoughts or motives, but the fact that Pilate offered to release Jesus to them, the King of the Jews, does allow us to see that Pilate expected these people to accept his offer. Well, I'm going to release to you. You want me to release somebody every year? I'll release him. Why? Because I found no guilt in him. He's innocent. Yet the fact that Pilate continues to seek the release of Jesus, And we'll see this more that when we come back to this. The next few weeks we're going to talk about, the Christmas season and what it means. But he keeps wanting to release Jesus. It gives us the ability to ponder. There's a real struggle in Pilate. There's this real problem that he is fighting against what he believes are his perceptions of injustice. These are real struggles for Pilate. He is a man. He is struggling with these things. How many times have you met people that are struggling with the issues in their lives, the issues of their world? Now, you know for a fact that they do not know Jesus Christ. There's a part of you that thinks, if they would understand who Jesus is, most of this, if not all of this, might go away, but, I still struggle with things. They would at least have a better grasp. They would know the person of peace. They would know the person who is truth. They would realize that there's a purpose in this world. Now, the fact that they don't know Jesus, does that make their struggles any less real? No. They're real struggles. In many ways, it makes them sadder. The way John concludes this chapter in verse 40 demonstrate that Pilate was indeed disturbed, as was John, by the crowd's cry of release of Barabbas. It just ends very short. Now Barabbas was a robber. Other versions use the term insurrectionist. He was a rebel. Today he would be called a terrorist. He was somebody that went around causing as many problems as he could. It didn't really matter what kind of problems they were. It didn't matter the body count. He just wanted to cause disruption, anarchy. The fact they chose someone who could cause both the Jews to suffer even more, and the reason why the Jews could suffer even more, because the Jews cried out for someone to be released that was a known criminal, a known rebel to Rome. And what it did, this highlighted the Jewish hatred for Jesus. The Jews were willing to trade their peaceful status quo, the way things are, their ability to worship, their ability to have whatever it was they had at the time. They were willing to trade that away to get at Jesus. Have you ever met people like that? That they just, you think, okay, you go down this road. You can turn right, you can turn left. One way is the right way, one way is the wrong way. Have you ever met those people that every single time they turn the wrong way? Don't you look at them and say, I was hoping that eventually you'd make a good choice? I was trying to explain this to my dad one time. He goes, yeah, now you know what it was like for me when I was raising you. And I was like, that was hurtful, I felt I needed a safe space all of a sudden, when your dad tells you that, They just can't seem to make the right choice. See, more than anything else, I think what this does is it highlights the danger of runaway emotional investment. There is a reason why we don't make big decisions based purely on emotions. Hey, when you go house shopping, and you just happen, let's just go into this house. Let's just see it. Okay, just see what it is. And you go in there and you're like, what do they do with this type of stuff? It's huge. Who needs a room this big? Who needs that in their bathroom? Who needs that in their kitchen? I wouldn't want to ever get this dirty. And you look at this stuff, and then you think about, I kind of deserve this. And if you go to your real estate person, they tell you that you qualify for a home 4 times more expensive than what you ever thought about. Well, if I qualify, it's got to be right, okay? No. That's an emotional decision, not a smart one. Now look, God has given us emotions. But far too often, what we find at the end of an emotional roller coaster where we have allowed ourselves to be controlled by emotion is just nothing but regret. See, this is interesting. Emotion is the condiment which provides our actions, or maybe even facts, if you will, with meaning. Emotions can provide the actions that we take with meaning, yet no one here ever desires to have a meal of ketchup, salt, and pepper. Why? You want something of substance. You want something that will be good for you. I mean, you think about it. God has designed us in a marvelous way. We sometimes get, like, I remember when I first came out of the hospital, even when I was in the hospital, I wanted meat. My body was craving for protein, I guess. I remember I called up Brian, and I said, "Could you do me a favor? Go to Burger King, go to Steak and Shake, get me a double steak burger, no cheese, ketchup only." Because plus, the doctor said that if I could eat something and keep it down and not get sick, that he would send me home, and I was on a mission. And so he brought that in. Now, by the time he got there, the fries were less than warm, but I tried a couple of them. Carbs didn't taste good at the time, but I took a bite of that hamburger. I chewed it twice. I just let it lay in my mouth, just like, oh, that was just so, oh, this is so wonderful. And Brian's looking at me like, do I need to press the nurse's button, And because my body knew, but what I craved for, it wasn't just the fact that I wanted plain dry meat in my mouth. I wanted to taste the salt. I wanted to taste the ketchup and the meat. Sometimes we have cravings for things, and those cravings that we have sometimes, a lot of times in our lives, if you think about what you have cravings for, we crave the emotions of something, but what we need is the substance of something. It is so very easy to get caught up in the emotions. We need to beware of those that play on our emotions. Because I've noticed that in my life personally, when I have been emotionally driven, I'm usually not thinking a lot. The actions of Pilate that are recorded here in verses 1 to 3, it demonstrates this huge inconsistency between Pilate's statement of being unable to find any guilt in him and the extreme cruelty that Pilate unleashed on Jesus. Now, John writes in verse 1 with extreme brevity, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him." Well, one commentator mentioned that Pilate was perhaps only wishing to go through the motions of a true flogging. Unfortunately, the descriptions of Jesus prove that the soldiers didn't get that memo. The severity of the beating and the facts that the Roman soldiers probably saw Jesus as the way for them to vent their anger at the fact that they had to stay in Jerusalem in this very small building where it was very unpleasant because of the fears that the Jews could not behave. John records that they placed a crown of thorns on him. I kind of jumped ahead last week when I was describing, Jesus before Pilate, but hey, it happens. Besides, let me remind you, I almost died in the middle of October, and who knows how this has affected my overall thinking. But I mentioned last week that when Jesus was first before Pilate, that he had the crown of thorns on him, and he did not. Because the soldiers made it, and they put it on him. And those thorns that they put on him were between 3.5 and 4.5 inches long. And they shoved that down on his head, causing him to bleed profusely. John also includes the fact that the soldiers taunted Jesus by saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now, the hail part and king part is something that the soldiers in Rome would have been used to doing because that's how they hail Caesar. And they would form a salute, but rather than saluting Jesus, they may have just stuck their hands out. But then John says that they struck Jesus on the face. And further demonstrated their disdain not only for Jesus, but for Jews, because Jesus was representative of the Jews. And we can't overlook the fact that Pilate clearly acknowledged that he could not find any guilt in Jesus whatsoever. And rather than immediately releasing Jesus in spite of the crowd's anger, I mean, come on, what was this crowd compared to who Rome was? Pilate used Jesus as a pawn, as bait, and he was trying to placate these crowds. This is exactly how all humans, this is how we use. Sometimes we get so caught up in something, we don't care what we have to do in order to get what we want. I remember one time I bought this car, and I thought if I buy it really fast, maybe God won't notice. Yeah, I'll just hurry up and do this, and then he'll bless me anyway. No. God allowed me to have 60 payments. Then he allowed me to have all types of other problems as well. When Pilate asked Jesus in verse 38, "What is truth?" and then immediately left his presence, Pilate rejected the embodiment of truth standing before him, and he walked away from the only one who could actually tell him what truth was, and for him to be satisfied with an answer. See, the actions of Pilate, they don't demonstrate an abandonment of seeking answers. Do you understand that? Pilate didn't all of a sudden, once he walked away from Jesus, he never sought to have another question answered. No, Pilate, in abandoning Jesus, the person of truth, he didn't abandon seeking answers, he abandoned seeking truthful answers. This is the sad state of affairs of everyone who rejects the person of Jesus Christ. They accept anything and everything. And then finally in verses 4 to 7, accepting everything rejects reality. Even a cursory study of Middle Eastern history during the time of Jesus Christ would grant us an understanding and insight into the cruelty and the evil that Pontius Pilate was capable of exacting on those under his charge. Yet what we witness in verse 4 is nothing short of absolutely breathtaking, and even perhaps it's a complete break with reality. After the mistreatment of Jesus at the hands of the soldiers, Pilate walks out. Now, Jesus isn't presented yet. He walks out to the crowd, and it's like he's giving them a preview. He goes, "See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him." Now, keep in mind, Jesus has been scourged almost to the point of death. How he was even able to stand at this point is a miracle that's only attested to the grace and strength of God. The soldiers had pressed this crown of thorns down on his head, causing him, if you've ever been cut on your head, your scalp, or above your eyebrows, you bleed profusely. Blood is just cascading down the front of his face. They beat him in his face, slapped him, causing contusions and bruises and swelling to the point where he was probably unrecognizable. So now Pilate brought out Jesus as an example, as an exemplar of innocence, telling the crowd, "See, this is the man that I found to be innocent." Now, the way Jesus looked should have shocked the crowd into complete silence, but it did not. Even Pilate should have been revolted by these conflicting realities of what Pilate said and what he actually had done. You know, I'm sitting here studying this past week, and one of the things I thought was this, is like, if this is what Pilate does to somebody that he finds innocent, what would it be like if someone was found guilty? Yet what is even more jarring to our psyche is the response of the crowd, a crowd which should have been more shocked with the way Pilate treated a fellow Jew. Yet instead of, they cried out, "Crucify him," twice. I mean, they couldn't get it out enough. They were so angry. And yet Pilate brings them out. They're screaming. He brings it out after he said, I just want you to know, I've not found any fault. He brings out Jesus, who's this beaten, battered, bloody mess that is barely recognizable as a man. And he says in the Latin, there's the Latin is incredibly infamous. Ecce homo. Behold the man. I mean, that's justice. Fairness. Perhaps Pilate thought that he was going to be able to regain some control over the crowd by shocking them. But what he did is he reminded them of their own inability to judge anyone. That's why he said, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. I beat the pudding out of this man. I just tortured him. He's lucky to be alive, but I can't find any guilt in him." I mean, don't you think that if you and I were to watch this, we see what he's done to this man, don't you think we'd have to take a thought and say, who are we dealing with that's in charge of this group? What will he do now to us? And really, if you think about that situation, about how that at any point that could have erupted into just, Pilate could have just said something to his soldiers, and his soldiers would have gladly gone into that crowd and just massacred everyone. He's done it before this time, and he'll do it again before he's transferred back to Rome. But look what the Jews say. They saw that. They could care less about Jesus. They could care less of who he was, what happened to him. They saw the life of Jesus. They heard the teachings of Jesus. It went nowhere. They refused everything. You and I would be brought to tears. Why? Because we know who Jesus Christ is. But what do they say? Listen what they say. They say this. They said, "We have a law." Now, the moment that they said this, they trapped Pilate. Because, see, Rome had a practice. Jews had a law, but the Romans had a practice. Let me finish what they said. "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." Verse 7. Now, it really doesn't matter what they say past "we have a law." See, this simple statement of Jewish law, it forced Pilate to enforce their law, and it removed Pilate's freedom of choice. See, it was a hallmark of Rome to enforce the cultural laws of those they ruled in order to maintain something that is called Pax Romana, Roman peace. Historically, Roman peace existed from 30 BC, which was just after Julius Caesar was murdered, to 180 AD. After that, Rome started deteriorating to the point in their culture and society that they no longer considered Roman peace to be ruled through that, but it was controlled by absolute totalitarian authority. Anyone that would do anything to cause Roman peace to be compromised would be immediately dealt with, usually killed. You didn't like the price of bread? We'll kill you. You didn't think that we handled something properly? We'll kill you. Everybody was going to be happy. It was going to be peaceful. Now, it gave Rome the ability to abound fully within society at that time, but it was brutal. And by the Jews realizing that Rome would be obligated to follow a law that they had in order to maintain peace, they removed any choice that Pilate had hoped that he would have. The next time we come back, the very next verse says, is that Pilate was very afraid. Pilate no longer had a choice. If he didn't comply with their law, Rome would look at him as being the cause of unrest. You know, we can look at the total disarray of the logic of this and wonder, how could any of this happen? Minimally, Pilate should have let Jesus go. Minimally, the Jews should have been forced to accept the justice of the Romans. I mean, Pilate said, I find no fault in him, and that should have been the end of it right there. But the reason that Pilate made several concessions and compromises before this that caused his problems to run even further out of hand. Minimally, Jesus should have never been mistreated and never been scourged. Yet there's almost a schizophrenic nature of this whole context, which still, as crazy as it is, it perfectly fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament and demonstrated God's sovereign will even over the choices of men. I think there's a scriptural principle that we too often forget, and it's this: prophecy does not require humanity to follow a specific path. Prophecy does not require humanity to follow a specific path. Prophecy only prescribes a specific end. You may think, I don't see how we're going to get to where God says we're going to get. Don't worry about it. God is going to use things that is beyond our capability to understand in order to accomplish his end. And guess what? God's not going to compromise his holiness. God's not going to compromise his righteousness. God's going to let man do what man likes to do. His way, his rebellion. And man's going to think that he's striking a blow against God the whole time he's doing it. Today, we are you realize right now that we are the furthest removed generation from the cross of Jesus Christ? And by the way, that's an event that literally split time in half. And of course, in our politically correct society that's always attempting to remove any vestige of Christianity from our culture, it's even scrubbed away the term Anno Domini, A.D. Anno Domini literally means the year of our Lord. You can see this for yourself. You go visit Cracker Barrel. They're going to have those old calendars on there, and it's going to say 1943, the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. And they've also scrubbed away before Christ, which is what BC stood for. And they've done this in almost all the reference books, all of your colleges, universities, any kind of writing. Now, they've replaced it using terms current era, which is CE, which basically means AD, and before current era, which basically meant BC, because they don't want to use the death of him whose name we will not mention secularly on a Roman cross as a dividing point in history. You don't think that's kind of silly? Those of us who know the truth, who have a relationship with the one who is the living God of truth, Jesus Christ, we see that the complete mayhem of reason and logic created by those, and these are people that, these are the people that they claim that they can have any gender they want, that there's no differences between men and women, that anything literally can be considered a marriage. And if I believe something, and if I say it, then it's true. And how dare you say that it's not? And unfortunately, what we're seeing is, he never wrote it as prophecy. He wrote it just as a dystopian novel. But when George Orwell wrote 1984, he talked about something that none of us could ever imagine, the thought police. And now, we're to a point now that not only must you allow me to do something, but you have to support me doing it. And you have to think in your mind that it's okay for me to do it, even though you may know that the Bible says that it's sin. The only chance that we have as believers in Jesus Christ of living a life that God is going to reward is we are going to be living more and more countercultural. we are not going to make sense to those that are not saved. Jesus or consequences is what it's going to be. I like what G.K. Chesterton said. He said that it's the dead fish that is swept downstream. Only a live fish can move upstream. See, it's either Jesus or his salvation, his sacrifice, and his life-changing spirit, or it's going to be the consequences of rejecting him. And the sad thing is, it's only those of us that have a relationship with Christ that are able to see this. You know, if you're being swept down a stream, and if all you're looking at is the water that you're in, you have no idea how fast you're going. You have no idea what direction you're going because you're just in that water. How is it that you can tell which way you're going or how you're going or how fast? You have to look at something on the bank that, guess what, doesn't move. This Bible has said the same thing ever since God wrote it. It's meant the same thing ever since God thought it. And without it, we'll never know where we're moving. Jesus or consequences. God has given us alone, his sheep, his people, the ability to know. And it should break our hearts when we see those that do not. And it should motivate us on telling them about Christ. Let's stand in prayer.